They called it the workhorse of the Wehrmacht, the German Sd.Kfz 7 heavy tractor, a vehicle that had hauled 88mm flak guns across Europe and transported supplies through the mud of Russia. American soldiers had often seen these enormous half-tracks abandoned along roads, disabled in combat, or captured intact as the German war machine fell apart. But they had never actually driven one. Not fully. Not until the spring of 1945, when GI crews finally climbed into the driver's seats of these captured German tractors and started their Maybach engines. They expected German engineering precision. They expected power and dependability. What they discovered instead would fundamentally alter how American military planners understood the hidden flaws that had helped doom the Third Reich, weaknesses that went far beyond tactics, training, or even industrial capacity. Sometimes the most revealing insights about an enemy's collapse are found not in grand strategic decisions, but in mundane details such as how much fuel a truck consumes per mile. By late 1944, the tide of war had turned decisively against Germany. American, British, and Canadian forces had broken out of Normandy and were racing across France toward the German frontier. Behind them, supply officers worked frantically to keep fuel, ammunition, and spare parts flowing to the rapidly advancing armies. Every gallon of gasoline had to be shipped across the Atlantic, offloaded at French ports, and trucked hundreds of miles to the front lines. Fuel efficiency was not just a peacetime concern, it was a matter of operational success or failure. The American military had standardized on a family of half-track vehicles for mechanized infantry and artillery support. Chief among these was the M3 half-track, a vehicle that would become as iconic to the American war effort as the Sherman tank or the Jeep. Produced in the tens of thousands, the M3 was powered by a White 60AX engine, a six-cylinder gasoline unit producing 148 horsepower. It was not exceptionally powerful by heavy truck standards, but it was reliable, relatively simple to maintain, and most importantly, it could be mass-produced using parts from American commercial truck manufacturers. The M3 could carry a driver and 12 soldiers in its armored body or tow light artillery pieces. Its 60-gallon fuel tank provided a range of roughly 220 miles on roads before refueling. That works out to approximately 3.7 miles per gallon on paved surfaces. Off-road through mud or sand, that figure dropped substantially, sometimes to as low as 2 miles per gallon. American soldiers accepted their half-track's thirstiness as the price of mechanized mobility. The German Sd.Kfz, by contrast, was a different machine entirely. Developed in the mid-1930s as part of Germany's program to create a family of standardized military tractors, the Sd.Kfz was designed to tow heavy artillery pieces, particularly the famous 88mm flak gun and the 15cm SFH-18 howitzer, whereas the M3 was built primarily for carrying infantry. The Sd.Kfz was built for raw pulling power. It was powered by a Maybach HL62 TUK engine, later upgraded to the HL64TR. These were six-cylinder, water-cooled gasoline engines producing 140 horsepower, similar in output to the American White engine, but that was where the similarity ended. The Maybach engine displaced 6.2 L, later 6.4 L, considerably larger than the American unit, and it consumed fuel at a rate that shocked American maintenance crews. German technical manuals listed the Sd.Kfz's fuel consumption at roughly 80 L per 100 kilometers on flat roads, about 3 miles per gallon, but that was under ideal conditions, with an experienced driver on good roads carrying moderate loads. Cross-country through the mud and snow of the Eastern Front, fuel consumption could soar to 160 L per 100 kilometers, just 1.5 miles per gallon. The vehicle carried 215 L of fuel in its tanks, approximately 57 gallons. On paper, this gave it a range of 250 kilometers, about 155 miles on roads. In practice, under combat conditions, the Sd.Kfz often required refueling after less than 75 miles of cross-country travel. These were not details that American intelligence analysts had focused on during the war. After all, when fighting an enemy, attention was paid to tank armor, gun penetration, and aircraft performance, not truck fuel efficiency. But in the spring of 1945, as American forces overran German positions and captured equipment by the hundreds, enterprising soldiers and officers began studying what they had seized. The story begins in March 1945 in the Rhineland, as American forces prepared to cross the Rhine River and push deep into Germany. The Ninth Army, under Lieutenant General William Simpson, had been tasked with a major river crossing operation. Engineers and logisticians worked tirelessly to stockpile supplies for the advance. Fuel depots were established, bridging equipment assembled, and every available vehicle pressed into service. During this hectic period, elements of the 9th Army's supply units discovered a nearly intact German motor pool that had been hastily abandoned. Among the vehicles left behind were several Sd.Kfz tractors, apparently left due to fuel shortages, a common fate for German vehicles in the final months of the war. Unlike many captured vehicles that were damaged or stripped for parts, these half-tracks were in remarkably good condition. A young captain in an ordnance company, a man whose name is lost to history but whose actions were recorded in after-action reports, made a decision that would prove revealing. Rather than simply cataloging the vehicles for intelligence or sending them to the rear for evaluation, he decided to put them into immediate use. His unit needed heavy towing vehicles to move artillery and supplies forward, and here were several fully functional tractors sitting idle. Why not use them? The first challenge was fuel. The Maybach engines ran on gasoline, the same as American vehicles, so fuel was not an issue. The Germans had taken most of their fuel during retreat, but American supplies were abundant. The second challenge was familiarization. None of the American drivers had ever operated a German half-track. The controls were arranged differently, the instrumentation was in German, and the driving characteristics were unfamiliar. But American soldiers were undaunted. Within a few hours, drivers were assigned to each vehicle, and after some trial and error, a few stalls, and gear-grinding mishaps, they got the Sd.Kfz running. The initial impression was positive. The Maybach engine roared to life with authority. The tracks, featuring the distinctive overlapping road wheel design of German armor, gripped the muddy ground with impressive traction. When hitched to a heavy artillery piece, the Sd.Kfz pulled without strain. One sergeant wrote home that the German half-track felt like driving a locomotive, powerful and steady, but heavier and more ponderous than the American vehicles he was used to. Steering required more effort, and while the suspension was effective, it transmitted more vibration to the crew, but the power was undeniable. Where an M3 might struggle under heavy loads or rough terrain, the Sd.Kfz just kept moving. For the first day or two, everyone was impressed. Here was German engineering at its finest: robust construction, a powerful engine, and excellent traction. Officers even suggested that future American vehicles might incorporate similar design features. But then fuel consumption figures began to arrive, and the picture shifted dramatically. Each captured Sd.Kfz had a full tank of American gasoline, roughly 57 gallons, the same as an M3. American drivers knew their M3s could go 200 miles or more on a full tank, even towing artillery. They were shocked when, after less than 90 miles of mixed road and cross-country travel, the Sd.Kfz were nearly out of fuel. Initially, crews assumed they had aired, perhaps a fuel leak, a partially empty tank, or inefficient driving. But as more miles were logged, the pattern was undeniable. The German half-tracks consumed nearly twice the fuel of the American M3s. The ordnance captain ordered a systematic test. One Sd.Kfz and one M3, both mechanically sound, were filled to capacity and sent on an identical route: 25 miles of pavement, 15 miles of moderate cross-country terrain, then 25 miles back. Each towed a 15 centimeters howitzer, roughly the same load they were designed to handle. The results were startling. The M3 completed the 65-mile loop with fuel to spare, consuming about 17 gallons, roughly 3.8 miles per gallon. The Sd.Kfz, running the same course, emptied its 57-gallon tank and needed emergency refueling. Analysis showed it burned roughly 63 gallons for the 65 miles, barely 1 mile per gallon. Arithmetic revealed the implications. Moving a battalion's artillery 100 miles with M3s required about 2,600 gallons, with Sd.Kfz, roughly 6,300 gallons, more than double. Scaled to a division or corps, this meant tens of thousands of extra gallons per day. American officers realized something critical: the German military had designed vehicles assuming fuel would always be available. Germany relied on synthetic fuel plants, captured Romanian oil fields, and expected rapid victories that would bring them to Caucasus oil fields. Fuel efficiency had not been a priority. By contrast, American planners had always treated every gallon as precious. Oil had to be shipped across submarine-fested oceans. It had to be transported hundreds of miles from ports to frontline units. American industry had developed engines that squeezed every possible mile out of every gallon, not because American engineers were necessarily more clever, but because American logistics demanded it. Germans had built for power and performance. The Americans had built for efficiency and sustainability. As more German vehicles fell into American hands in the spring of 1945, this pattern repeated itself again and again. The German trucks, the Opel Blitz, and the Mercedes-Benz models consistently consumed more fuel per mile than their American counterparts. The German armored vehicles, the Panther and Tiger tanks, were notorious fuel hogs. managing less than 1 mile per gallon, even on roads. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, flew aircraft that burned through fuel at prodigious rates. Intelligence officers began collecting data and a picture emerged. The German military was exquisitely designed for short, violent campaigns where fuel could be captured from the enemy or stockpiled in advance. It was terribly suited for long wars of attrition where every gallon mattered. This had not been apparent in 1939 and 1940 when German forces had overrun Poland and France in weeks, but by 1943 and 1944, with Germany fighting on multiple fronts and Allied bombing campaign targeting synthetic fuel plants, the fuel hunger of German vehicles had become a critical vulnerability. The American soldiers examining captured Sd.Kfz 7s began to notice other details that reinforced this pattern. The vehicles were built like tanks, heavy and over-engineered. Every component seemed designed for maximum strength rather than optimal efficiency. The Maybach engine, while powerful, was a complex piece of machinery with precision fuel injection systems that required careful maintenance and adjustment. When these systems were not perfectly tuned, fuel consumption increased even more. The American white engine in the M3, by contrast, was based on commercial truck engine designs. It was simpler, more forgiving of imperfect maintenance, and designed from the outset to be fuel efficient. American automotive engineers had spent decades optimizing internal combustion engines for fuel economy because American consumers cared about operating costs. That civilian engineering legacy paid enormous dividends when those same design principles were applied to military vehicles. Consider the practical implications on the battlefield. American Mechanized Infantry Company with 12 cubic meters half-tracks could operate for a full day's combat operations, moving 20 to 30 m with approximately 200 gal of fuel. The same company equipped with German Sd.Kfz would need closer to 500 gallons for the same operations. Scale that up to a division with hundreds of vehicles and the difference becomes enormous. American logistics planners had calculated that each frontline division required approximately 50,000 gallons of fuel per day for all its vehicles combined, tanks, trucks, half-tracks, and support vehicles. A German Panzer division with its less fuel-efficient vehicles required closer to 75,000 gallons per day. When Germany was winning in capturing enemy fuel stocks, this was manageable. When Germany was retreating and Allied bombers were hitting fuel production facilities, it became impossible. American soldiers driving captured Sd.Kfz 7s in the spring of 1945 found themselves stopping for fuel twice as often as they would in their own vehicles. They found themselves watching fuel gauges drop with alarming speed. They found themselves understanding in a visceral and immediate way why so many German vehicles had been abandoned on roadsides with empty tanks. The Germans had not abandoned those vehicles because they were mechanically unreliable. They had abandoned them because they had literally run out of gas. One particularly revealing incident occurred in early April 1945 as American forces advanced through central Germany. A supply column that included both American M3s and captured Sd.Kfz 7s was tasked with bringing ammunition and supplies to a forward artillery position approximately 80 miles behind the rapidly moving front lines. The mixed convoy left the supply depot early in the morning with all vehicles fully fueled. The American half-tracks completed the round trip without requiring any refueling. They returned to base with fuel to spare, the German half-tracks running the exact same route under the exact same conditions had to be refueled at the midpoint of the journey. Without that emergency refueling, they would have been stranded. The convoy commander, a major with extensive logistics experience, included this incident in his after-action report with a note that read, "German vehicles unsuitable for sustained operations due to excessive fuel consumption." This was not an isolated incident. Across Germany in the spring of 1945, similar stories were playing out. Wherever American units tried to employ captured German vehicles, a tank retrieval unit found that German heavy tank recovery vehicles, variants of the Sd.K9, could pull disabled tanks that American wreckers struggled with. But those German wreckers needed refueling so frequently that they actually took longer to complete recovery missions because they spent so much time stopped for gas.
An artillery battalion that
briefly used captured Sd.Kfz 7s to tow their 105mm howitzers reported that the
German tractors had better traction in muddy conditions than American vehicles. But the report also noted that the
German tractors required fuel trucks to accompany them on every movement, which negated their tactical advantages by increasing the size and vulnerability of the convoy. American soldiers also noted that the German vehicles' fuel tanks seemed poorly designed for the vehicle's actual consumption rates.
The M3's 60 gallons tank was carefully sized to give the vehicle adequate operational range.
The Sd.Kfz 7's 215L tank, roughly 57 g, was actually
slightly smaller relative to the vehicle's size, but its consumption rate meant it needed refueling much more frequently. It was as if German engineers had not fully appreciated how much fuel their vehicles would actually
use under combat conditions.
Some American maintenance crews experimented with ways to improve the fuel efficiency of captured German vehicles.
They tried different driving techniques, adjusted fuel mixtures, and tuned carburetors. They achieved marginal improvements,
perhaps 5 or 10% better fuel economy, but they could not overcome the fundamental design reality that the Maybach engine in its large heavy vehicle platform was simply thirstier than the American alternative. The irony
was not lost on American tankers and truck drivers.
Here they were operating
in the heart of Germany with fuel being shipped from Texas and Oklahoma, keeping
German-designed vehicles running.
The Germans fighting on their own soil could
not keep their own vehicles fueled. What did that say about the sustainability of the German war machine? German fuel
production had peaked in early 1944 at approximately 5.7 million tons per year. By the spring of 1945, it had collapsed to less than 1 million tons per year, a
drop of more than 80%.
Allied bombing of synthetic fuel plants, particularly the concentrated attacks in the summer of 1944, had devastated German fuel
production.
The loss of the Romanian oil fields to Soviet advances in August 1944 removed another crucial fuel source. The German military had tried to compensate through strict fuel rationing.
By early 1945, fuel allocations to frontline units were being cut repeatedly.
Training flights for Luftwaffe pilots were cancelled to save fuel.
Tank units were ordered to minimize movement.
Horse-drawn wagons and carts, supposedly obsolete in the age of mechanized warfare, made a comeback as German units
tried to conserve their dwindling fuel supplies for combat vehicles, but rationing could not overcome the fundamental problem that German vehicles needed too much fuel. Even with strict rationing, German panzer divisions were frequently immobilized.
They could not maneuver to respond to Allied attacks.
They could not retreat to better defensive positions.
They could not advance to exploit tactical
opportunities.
They simply sat in place waiting for fuel that never came until Allied forces
overran them. After action, reports from this period contain numerous anecdotes about captured German vehicles.
One report from an armored division described how a captured Panther tank performed beautifully during a short-range attack, but had to be abandoned after just 15 miles because it had consumed all its fuel, and the American supply chain could not afford to keep it fed.
Another report from an engineering battalion noted that captured Sd.Kfz 7s were useful for short distance heavy hauling, but were
being phased out of regular use because they burned fuel like it was going out of style.
Some American units continued
to use captured German vehicles, but only for specific short-range tasks where their power advantages outweighed
their fuel consumption drawbacks. A few Sd.Kfz ended up being used as static
power sources,
their engines running generators at forward bases.
Others were simply parked and cannibalized for spare
parts. The German half-tracks that had once epitomized mechanized warfare efficiency were now seen by American soldiers as examples of impractical excess. The broader lesson was being learned at
every level of Dutter, the American military.
German equipment looked impressive,
sounded impressive, and in short-term tactical situations often performed impressively, but the German military had not solved the fundamental problem of modern mechanized warfare, how to keep your vehicles supplied with fuel. The American military had solved it, not through any particular technological breakthrough, but through careful attention to logistics and fuel efficiency. General Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, had famously said that amateurs talk strategy while professionals talk logistics.
The fuel consumption comparison between American and German vehicles was a perfect illustration of this principle.
The Germans had built tactically superior vehicles in many cases. The Panther tank had better armor and a better gun than the Sherman.
The Stand.Kfz could tow heavier loads than the M3.
But these tactical advantages meant nothing if the vehicles
could not be kept supplied with fuel.
The American logistics system, often underappreciated in accounts of World
War II, was perhaps America's greatest military achievement. From oil wells in Texas and California, crude oil traveled to refineries where it was processed into gasoline and diesel fuel. That
refined fuel was loaded onto tankers and shipped across the Atlantic, running a gauntlet of German submarines.
The fuel
was offloaded at ports in Britain or France, loaded onto trains or trucks, and transported hundreds of miles to
forward fuel dumps.
From there, it was distributed to division supply points
and finally delivered to individual units down to the company level.
This entire system, stretching from Texas to
the front lines in Germany, moved millions of gallons of fuel every day. American logisticians had calculated that every gallon of fuel delivered to a frontline tank represented roughly 4 gallons total when you accounted for the fuel used by the ships and trucks transporting it.
But the system worked. American units rarely faced fuel shortages in the final year of the war.
The German logistics system, by contrast,
had broken down completely. German synthetic fuel plants, which had provided much of Germany's fuel supply,
were being systematically destroyed by Allied bombing. The Romanian oil fields captured by Soviets in August 1944 were lost.
German fuel production was a fraction of what it had been a year earlier.
And what little fuel Germany
still produced had to be distributed across multiple fronts with railways and roads under constant air attack.
But,
even if Germany had somehow maintained its fuel production, the fuel consumption rates of German vehicles
would have posed a problem.
A study conducted by American intelligence in mid-1945 estimated that Germany would
have needed approximately 25% more fuel production just to match the operational tempo that American forces sustained with
their more efficient vehicles.
Germany's fuel-hungry vehicles were not just a problem when fuel was scarce, they would have been a burden even in a best-case scenario. The comparison extended beyond just half-tracks.
American tank crews noted that captured German Panther tanks, while impressively armed and armored, consumed fuel at
approximately half a mile per gallon.
A Sherman tank achieved closer to 1 mile per gallon. The Panther needed roughly
twice as much fuel to cover the same distance.
This meant that a Panther-equipped armored division needed twice
as many fuel trucks, twice as many fuel dumps, and twice as much logistical support as a Sherman-equipped division.
German tank destroyers, vehicles like the Jag Panther and Jag Tiger, were even worse.
These heavy vehicles mounting powerful guns on tank chassis were tactically impressive.
They could destroy any Allied tank from long range, but they were also among the most fuel-inefficient vehicles ever designed. American tankers who examined captured Jag Tigers after the war were amazed that Germany had even attempted to field such vehicles. One officer's report noted that a Jag Tiger burned more fuel sitting idle with its engine running for an hour than a Sherman used traveling 10
mi. By April of 1945, as American forces drove deeper into Germany and the Reich
collapsed around them, captured German vehicles littered the roadsides by the thousands.
Many were damaged or
destroyed in combat.
But a significant percentage had simply been abandoned when they ran out of fuel. The German
soldiers had left them behind, not because the vehicles were broken, but because there was no more gasoline to
put in their tanks.
American intelligence officers compiled reports on German fuel supplies and consumption
rates. The numbers told a devastating story. At the height of German power in
1941 and 1942, Germany had produced or captured enough fuel to keep its military machine
running barely.
But as the war dragged on, as synthetic fuel plants were bombed, as the Romanian oil fields were lost to Soviet advances, German fuel supplies dwindled. By 1944, German panzer divisions were often immobilized, not by enemy action, but by lack of fuel. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 to January 1945 had been Germany's last major offensive in the West. One of the operation's fundamental assumptions was that German forces would capture American fuel dumps early in the offensive and use that captured fuel to sustain their advance. When that did not happen, when American defenders held key fuel dumps or destroyed them before retreating, the German offensive literally ran out of gas. Panther and Tiger tanks were found abandoned with empty fuel tanks just a few miles from their starting positions. The Ardennes offensive had been planned with explicit recognition of Germany's fuel shortage. German planners calculated that they had enough fuel to reach the Meuse River about halfway to their objective of Antwerp, but only if they captured American fuel stocks along the way. This was an extraordinarily risky assumption, betting an entire offensive on the hope of capturing enemy supplies. When the offensive began on December 16, some German units did capture small American fuel dumps, but the quantities were insufficient for the number of vehicles involved. American defenders, recognizing the fuel situation, prioritized defending or destroying fuel stocks at Stavelot. American engineers blew up a fuel dump containing hundreds of thousands of gallons just hours before German forces arrived. The explosion was so massive it could be heard for miles. German armored spearheads, including units equipped with Sd.Kfz 7s and other heavy vehicles, found themselves stranded as early as December 18, just 2 days into the offensive. Some Panther tanks covered less than 30 miles before running out of fuel. Sd.Kfz towing artillery pieces were abandoned when they could not reach the advancing infantry they were supposed to support. The offensive, which Hitler had hoped would split the Allied armies, ground to a halt largely because of fuel shortages. American intelligence officers interrogating captured German soldiers after the Battle of the Bulge heard the same story. Repeatedly, German units had been ordered to advance, had tried to advance, but had stopped because they had no fuel. Tank commanders described watching their fuel gauges drop toward empty while waiting for fuel trucks that never came. Sd.Kfz 7 drivers recounted abandoning their vehicles within sight of their objectives because they had burned through their fuel just getting to the battle. One captured German lieutenant interrogated in January 1945 told his American captors that his artillery units Sd.K7s had consumed all their fuel in the initial advance and had been immobilized ever since. His guns had remained silent during critical phases of the battle, not because they lacked ammunition, they had plenty of ammunition, but because the tractors that were supposed to move the guns to new firing positions had no fuel. The Americans filing the interrogation report noted with dark humor that German engineering prowess had created vehicles so powerful they could not actually be used. The fuel consumption comparison became a regular topic of conversation among American soldiers in the winter and spring of 1945. GIS swapped stories about captured German vehicles. One corporal wrote home about driving a captured German half-track, which he found impressive, until he realized it needed refueling twice as often as his regular vehicle. A sergeant in a maintenance company wrote about trying to keep a captured Sd.Kfz 7 running and discovering that its fuel tank was empty after just 60 miles of use. These were not just amusing anecdotes. They represented a fundamental insight into why the Allies were winning the war. The American military had built a sustainable war machine. The German military had built an unsustainable one. German vehicles were often better in individual performance metrics. Faster, more powerful, better armored. But when you accounted for fuel consumption, maintenance requirements, and logistics sustainability, American vehicles were superior where it counted. American soldiers walking through those battlefields in early 1945 saw the evidence everywhere. Powerful German vehicles, beautifully engineered, utterly stranded. Some American GIS took to spray painting messages on abandoned German tanks out of gas or thanks for the memories. There was a dark humor in but also a recognition of a fundamental truth. The Germans had lost the fuel war long before they lost the shooting war. The Sd.Kfz-7 became something of a symbol of this failure. It was not as famous as the Tiger tank or the Panther, but to the American soldiers who actually had to operate captured German vehicles, it represented everything that was wrong with German military planning. Here was a vehicle that could do things American vehicles could not do, could tow heavier loads, could traverse worse terrain, but it needed twice the fuel to do it. And in a war where fuel logistics determined success, that extra fuel consumption was not a minor detail. It was a fatal flaw. Some German officers after the war would argue that Germany lost because of Allied numerical superiority or strategic bombing or the two-front war. All of these factors mattered. But at the tactical level, where individual soldiers and small units fought, survived, or perished, the fuel consumption problem was immediate and unmistakable. German units in 1945 were often immobilized. They could not maneuver, could not retreat, could not advance because they lacked fuel. American units, by contrast, rarely experienced fuel shortages. The American logistics system, despite occasional hiccups, kept fuel flowing to frontline formations. American trucks and half-tracks might not have been as powerful as their German counterparts, but they kept moving. In a war where mobility meant survival, that made all the difference. The young captain who first tested captured Sd.Kfz against American M3s likely did not realize he was documenting a major strategic insight. He was simply trying to determine whether these captured vehicles were worth using. But his basic fuel consumption test revealed a fundamental asymmetry between American and German approaches to mechanized warfare. The Germans had prioritized power and performance. The Americans had emphasized efficiency and sustainability. In a short conflict, the German approach might have worked. In a protracted war, the American approach was decisive. By May 1945, when Germany surrendered, the American military had seized thousands of German vehicles. Some were shipped back to the United States for detailed technical evaluation. Engineers at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland disassembled German engines, examined their fuel injection systems, and analyzed their transmission designs. They confirmed what frontline soldiers had already observed: German vehicles were engineering marvels in many ways, but horrendously inefficient in terms of fuel usage. The Aberdeen testing was thorough. German engines were placed on dynamometers and run through full power cycles. Fuel consumption was measured under laboratory conditions at various loads and speeds. The data confirmed field observations. The Maybach HL62 engine in the Sd.Kfz consumed roughly 30% more fuel per horsepower than the American White 160AX engine. This was not because the Maybach was poorly designed, it was actually highly sophisticated. But German engineers had optimized for power density and reliability, not fuel efficiency. American engineers noted several design features that contributed to the problem. The Maybach engine used a relatively low compression ratio, limiting thermal efficiency. It had a complex carburetor system that often ran rich, supplying more fuel than necessary to ensure dependable operation under all conditions. Engine timing was conservative, set to maximize power output rather than minimize fuel use. Any one of these choices alone would have been manageable. Together, they produced substantially higher fuel consumption. The Americans also examined the full Sd.Kfz powertrain. The transmission, though robust, had wide gear ratios that often forced the engine to run at higher RPMs than required. Final drive ratios were tuned for pulling power rather than cruising efficiency. Again, these were defensible choices for maximum performance, but poor ones if conserving fuel was important. A September 1945 Aberdeen report concluded that the Sd.Kfz represented outstanding German engineering applied to the wrong optimization targets. The report noted that if American engineers had been given the same requirements, tow 8 tons, carry 12 men, operate in all terrain, they would have designed a very different vehicle. The American approach would have prioritized fuel efficiency and maintainability over raw power. The post-war U.S. military embraced these lessons. When developing new generations of armored vehicles and trucks in the late 1940s and 1950s, fuel efficiency was a key design criterion. The M59 armored personnel carrier, which replaced the M3 half-track, achieved roughly 4 miles per gallon, outperforming the M3 despite being larger. The M113 armored personnel carrier, introduced in the 1960s, continued this emphasis on efficiency. Specifications for new vehicles explicitly included fuel consumption limits. Contrast this with Soviet vehicle development. Soviet designers, working in a country with abundant oil reserves, were less concerned about efficiency. Cold War Soviet armored vehicles were notoriously fuel-hungry, sometimes exceeding the consumption of German World War II vehicles. But the Soviets could supply the fuel,
the Germans could not. The economic impact of the fuel difference was enormous.
By early 1945, American forces in Europe consumed roughly 300 million gallons of gasoline per month. At German rates, this would have been closer to 500 million gallons per month, requiring more tankers, ports, trucks, and infrastructure, possibly delaying or preventing operations. Germany, with limited fuel resources, could never have sustained American-style operations. With German-level inefficiency, German forces were immobilized even on home soil. Some historians argue that Germany's fuel shortage was the single most critical material constraint determining the outcome of the war in the West. German units in the final year repeatedly could not maneuver, not because of a lack of vehicles or trained crews, but because fuel was unavailable. The Sd.Kfz itself had an unusual post-war life. Some captured examples were used by Allied forces for a few years. The Czechoslovak army operated several into the early 1950s. The vehicles were well built and could run for years with proper maintenance, but remained fuel guzzlers. As soon as more efficient alternatives emerged, they were retired. Today, surviving Sd.Kfz reside in military museums worldwide. Visitors marvel at their robust construction, track suspension, and imposing presence. They imagine these machines towing 88mm flak guns across European battlefields. But the museum placards rarely mention fuel consumption. Few note that these vehicles required refueling twice as often as their American equivalents. American GIs who drove these captured half-tracks in 1945 remembered. In reunions and memoirs, many recounted the experience with a mix of respect and amusement. Yes, the German half-track was powerful. Yes, it could accomplish impressive feats, but it drank fuel voraciously. You could almost watch the gauge drop as you drove. There is a broader lesson about technology in warfare. The most impressive weapon is not always the most effective. Performance matters, but sustainability matters more. A tank capable of defeating any enemy tank is useless if it cannot reach the battlefield due to fuel shortages. A half-track that can tow the heaviest artillery is a liability if it requires a dedicated fuel truck. The Germans learned this lesson too late. By the time they realized fuel efficiency needed to be a design priority, they were losing the war and lacked the industrial capacity to redesign their fleet. The Americans, perhaps through foresight or luck, had built their military machine with efficiency in mind. When soldiers climbed out of captured Sd.Kfz in spring 1945 and tallied their fuel consumption, they recognized a fundamental truth: the Third Reich had failed logistically as well as strategically and tactically. The German military had created a force that demanded resources it could not sustain. The Americans built a force that could keep fighting as long as factories operated and ships delivered supplies. The fuel comparison was just one data point among thousands, but a revealing one. German engineering excellence had been directed toward the wrong objectives. Germans optimized for ideal condition performance, Americans optimized for realistic, sustained operations. When the constraints of a multi-year global war became apparent, the American approach proved superior. In the end, the German Sd.Kfz and the American M3 half-track told different stories about their nation's approaches to warfare. The Sd.Kfz embodied the German belief that superior quality and performance would prevail. The M3 embodied the American belief that adequate quality, combined with quantity and sustainability, would win. History confirmed the Americans were right. When historians analyze Germany's defeat in World War II, they cite many factors: two-front war, industrial disparities, strategic bombing, tactical errors, ideological extremism, and more. Somewhere in that analysis, though, there should be a footnote about fuel consumption: how German vehicles burned gasoline at twice the rate of American ones, how GIs were astonished by captured half-tracks' thirst, and how a machine as powerful as the Sd.Kfz could become a liability due to fuel inefficiency. The German soldier racing across Russia in 1941 with captured Soviet fuel may never have worried about economy. But the German soldier in 1945, watching the gauge drop with no fuel depot in sight, understood the problem. German logistics had not kept pace with ambitions, and vehicles assumed unlimited fuel. The Americans, more pragmatic or perhaps more aware of limitations, built vehicles that could operate even under tight supply. An M3 could reach the next fuel point, and Sd.Kfz could not. In the attritional warfare of 1944-45, that difference was decisive. When reflecting on World War II mechanized warfare, on half-tracks, trucks, and vehicles that moved armies across continents, remember the fuel story. Remember the soldiers who climbed into captured German machines and discovered that engineering excellence carried a hidden cost. Remember that sometimes the most critical victory is not on the battlefield, but at the fuel pump. In a war where every gallon counted, the side with efficient vehicles had an advantage as real and decisive as superior tactics or better trained soldiers. The Sd.Kfz was remarkable, but ultimately a symbol of why Germany could not sustain its war effort. Power without sustainability is weakness. Performance without efficiency is failure.
failure.
American GIs learned this in spring 1945, driving captured German half-tracks that kept running dry. It was a lesson shaping American military thinking for generations.